Thank you for joining me for another episode of Sam's Tech Stuff. Today we'll be taking a look at what I think is one of the best bang for the buck CPU coolers on the market. Folks over at Scythe US asked me to do a review of the Mugen 5 Rev.B CPU cooler. After taking a look at it, it definitely looked like an interesting cooler, so I agreed and they sent me one to take a look at. The Mugen 5 cooler is compatible with the latest consumer grade Intel and AMD platforms, including the AM4 socket, which I think is a highlight for this cooler. The cooler is one of the single tower type coolers, and this one in particular has 6 heat pipes. The cooler does support a maximum of 2 fans in a push-pull configuration. The Mugen 5s come with one 120mm Kaze Flex fan out of the box. The Kaze Flex fans are capable of spinning as low as 300 RPM, which will give you pretty darn near ultra-silent operation. But they can also spin up to about 1200 RPM for maximum cooling performance. In terms of the CFM, at its lowest rated speed, they put out about 16.5 CFM, and at the max speed, they put out just over 51 CFM. At the slowest speed that the fans spin, the sound rating is about 4 decibels. At the max speed that they spin at, the sound rating is just under 25 decibels. And 25 decibels at 51 CFM is relatively quiet. I think most people generally reference about 25 decibels to the average room or probably a library just before it closes at the end of the day. So that is pretty darn quiet. In terms of size, this is a pretty beefy cooler. There is a pretty dense fin stack on this cooler, and it does come with 6 heat pipes that go through the nickel-plated copper cold plate. The most interesting feature about this cooler is actually how the tower is offset from where it mounts to the motherboard directly over the CPU socket. Put a picture on the screen to show this. The entire tower is pushed towards the rear of the case. They did this basically to enhance the memory compatibility. These days there are a ton of memory kits out there that have huge heat sinks, and a lot of them also have RGB lighting effects. So by shifting the heat sink over to the rear side of the case, they were basically allowing anyone to use any memory modules they want, up to the tallest that you can get. And this cooler with both fans installed wouldn't actually block any of the RGB goodness that you're getting from your RAM. So that is definitely something important to note. Now that we have some of the technical stuff out of the way, let's take a look at unboxing this and getting it installed in the Ryzen 3600 rig that I built just a little while ago on the channel. So this is the retail packaging that the Mugen 5 is going to come in. Let's take a look at unboxing this here. Grab the accessory kit. This is pretty common with most heatsinks. You'll have the tools and the mounting brackets in here. So this is actually kind of nice. They include a screwdriver for the purpose of installing this. I will say this is the only heatsink I have ever actually got a screwdriver with a handle in, which that is kind of interesting. We'll set that off to the side. Oh, looks like everything opened upside down in the bag there. Some instructions. So, you should definitely read the instructions. That being said, we'll take a look at everything included. Here are the clips. As I was talking about earlier in the video, you see that you have 4 in total. 2 will be for the included fan, and 2 are in case you want to buy another fan for push-pull. So it's nice to see that these are actually included. I'll set these down over here. It does look like Scythe included their own thermal grease solution, so I will definitely be using that when I test this out on the 3600. This looks like the screw and the spacer mounting kit. This is pretty standard among most of the larger tower coolers. It's good to see that. Here are the mounting brackets. So these look like they were constructed well. Here we've got all the thumb screws and the smaller screws. They all look like they're pretty decent quality. We've got the other 2 brackets. Again, quite stiff, good quality. And then we actually have the mounting plate. And here you can tell on the bottom side, you do have rubber mounting pads, so that's nice to see also. So this is the included fan with the Scythe cooler. You can see it's one of the designs where they have a ton of fins. These fans look like they're probably about 1.5 watts each, so nothing too power hungry. We do get a PWM connector, which is nice. That's the 4-pin. Cable's nicely sleeved. It looks great. Another nice touch is the rubber addition to the corners here. That way that'll keep the fan from vibrating in your case and making horrible, terrible noises. And just in case anyone didn't see earlier, this is a 120mm fan. Smaller profile, which is also nice to see. So here's the CPU cooler. Slide this whole package out. Grab the styrofoam. Here's the actual cooler itself. So very carefully remove this from the box. So here's the Mugen 5 cooler without the fan or anything mounted to it. You can tell the fin density is pretty nice, and it is nice to see all of the heat pipes on here. They are pretty thick, so the performance should be pretty good. Flip this upside down. It's a nice surface, and you can see that this particular heatsink is set up with the 2-screw mounts. One nice thing I did not notice earlier is looking at this heatsink now, given the way the heat pipes are positioned and this little cutout for the fins, this looks like it was designed purposefully to enhance RAM compatibility. A lot of times with these beefier cooler towers, you end up running into a problem where the fins end up extending into the area where the RAM would be. And if you have fast RAM, you probably have tall heat sinks on them. Or if you have RGB RAM, you probably have taller sinks that also have the lights in them. So it's nice to see that the heatsink is moved over a little bit and has this cutout. This should allow for greater compatibility with tall RAM sticks and tall VRM heat sinks on the other side, which is very nice to see. Now we'll switch over to the actual build itself. And if you remember, this is the Ryzen 5 3600 build that I featured previously on the channel. Right now you can see it's running the included AMD Wraith Stealth heatsink, which is decent if you don't have any other way to cool your CPU. But to be honest, it definitely, in my testing, has caused throttling under virtually all loads. 3D Mark, crypto mining, encoding, gaming, benchmarking, all of that. This heatsink is good enough to get the job done, but it really can't cool the CPU in order to get the highest automatic overclocks, and it certainly cannot cool the CPU for any kind of manual overclock. So we're going to take a look at removing that and installing the Mugen 5 from Scythe. So we're going to unplug the stock fan right there and take a look at unscrewing it. And just to remind everybody, this is basically all of the aluminum that you have cooling your CPU when you use the included AMD Wraith Stealth heatsink. You can see, yes, it's enough to the CPU from lighting your PC and house on fire, but it's really not enough for any kind of CPU intensive workload or overclocking whatsoever. So we're done with that for now. Now that the stock heatsink is off, it's time to clean the old thermal paste off the CPU. Definitely recommend some kind of alcohol prep pads. These work pretty well. I'm just gonna wipe that off. Fold this over, see if I can get a little bit more. So now that the CPU is cleaned off, we're going to go ahead and install the mounting kit. For the AM4 motherboards, we're actually going to use the stock back mounting plate. We won't use the one that I showed earlier in the video. That's basically just for the Intel systems. So we need the spacers and the screws that will actually go into the back plate. We'll get these installed to secure the back plate, and then we can start mounting the arms and the heatsink itself. So in order to start this, we're going to start out on the left hand side with this bracket, one of these spacers, and the screw. Now that we have the brackets on, we'll tip the case over, get the thermal paste on, and install the heatsink. So we're going to take a look at using the Scythe thermal compound. And we'll do the P size in the middle of the CPU there. In case anyone wants to take a look at all of the different various methods for applying thermal paste on a CPU, I will link the Gamers Nexus video below. Before we install the tower cooler, we do have to peel this off. You want to be very careful not to touch the cold plate. Now there are two different sides to this. The side without the cutout will have the main fan on it. So we're going to end up installing it with the indent on the side facing the VRM. So I'm going to get this situated here. Now that the cooler is on the board, I'm going to go ahead and screw it in. First screw will actually be right through here. Make sure the heat sinks down pretty tight. Feels like we're making pretty much perfect contact there. Now that we have the tower installed, we can get the fan on the back and we can start doing some testing. We're going to use the included Scythe fan. Here I have a test fit. I'm just holding the fan in. One important thing to notice is that there are actually cutouts here right where the fan is supposed to fit. So you can see it's seated in place there. Then we're going to lock it in with the included clips. See the clips pre-installed. So we're going to take a look at installing the fan in this orientation. Now the fan's installed, we'll go ahead and plug that in. So we get our fan power and readings. Really not a fan of leaving a lot of extra slack like this kind of flopping around in the case. One option would be to hide it back there if you have some kind of case management, and that is what I plan on doing. That way we keep the cable nice and out of the way. This is the default configuration for the Mugen 5 with the fan on the push side, pushing air through the tower to the back of the case. And I do have an exhaust here, so it wouldn't really necessarily be required to put a fan here. But after I do testing with just the single fan configuration, I will be putting the other fan on for a push-pull scenario. And I'll keep this be quiet fan here just to help exhaust everything out of the case. So first we'll take a look at the completely stock auto setup. For these benchmarks, the motherboard settings were all set to auto, and I was running the included Wraith Stealth heatsink. So for the handbrake test, I chose to re-encode the 2600X video from the original Hit Film Express output to H.265. So the completely stock setup ran this in 11 minutes and 57 seconds, and the max peak temperature was 84°C. In terms of Cinebench R15, the completely stock auto score was 1525, and the highest temperature reported was 79°C. For 3D Mark, I chose to record the CPU scores. Completely stock CPU score was 5943, and the temperatures were 82°C max. And the last benchmark was just a quick and dirty Kriptonite V7 mining benchmark. The default hashes were 680, and the highest temp that I saw was 84.3°C. One thing to keep in mind when you do see these scores, this was really more of a test for the heatsink, not the actual performance of the CPU. For reference, I'm only running the RAM in single channel and at 2133 MHz for these tests. So let's move on to the Mugen 5 cooler with the one included fan and the rest of the motherboard settings completely set to stock or default. So for the handbrake test, because there was more thermal headroom, the CPU did boost about 50 to 75 extra megahertz, so it was able to finish slightly faster in 11 minutes and 53 seconds, and the max reported CPU core temp was 72°C. For the Cinebench R15 run, the score jumped a little bit to 1557 at 75°C. For the 3D Mark run, the CPU score was about 6028, and the reported max average temp was 76 degrees. For the V7 mining test, we are looking at 740 hashes a second at 73.4°C. And finally, we'll move on to the ultimate form, the dual fan push-pull on the Mugen. The CPU was overclocked to 4.1 gigahertz using 1.4 volts. You might find the voltage a little high for Ryzen 3000, but I wanted to do this as just a nice round number because some people may actually go up to this to get that very last bin or two. So the handbrake test on average finished in 11 minutes and 35 seconds, which is a much nicer improvement over the stock 1157. If you take this percentage improvement and span it over, say, encodes that could last a couple of days or a week, this will definitely save you a lot of time and energy. The max reported temp, though, at this voltage was 83°C. For the Cinebench R15 run, the runs averaged out to a score of 1600, and the max average temp was about 75°C. For the 3D Mark CPU test, at 4.1 gigahertz, 1.4 volts, I was able to get an average of 6153 for the score, and the max average temp was 71.3°C. And lastly, the V7 mining benchmark, we were able to get 763 hashes a second at 75°C average. So you can see the Mugen 5 just by default will definitely let the CPU boost a little bit higher, but it's important that I note in the video that I'm using the Ryzen 3600 on an X470 motherboard, specifically the MSI X470 Gaming Plus. So there's been a couple of BIOS updates, but even after these BIOS updates, I am 100% confident that the boosting algorithm is not working correctly. No matter what the temperature is, I can't get the CPU to boost over 3.95 gigahertz. In terms of the manual overclocking, I chose 4.1 gigahertz because that was basically the max I could get. A lot of people are getting a bit higher than 4.1 gigahertz, so I'm kind of thinking this motherboard was definitely a limiting factor in the clock speeds. If you're using an X570, I would fully expect that once you put a cooler like this on your CPU, you're almost certainly going to get more than 50 to 75 megahertz boost. My guess is you probably would get closer to 1 to 200 megahertz boost, possibly even more if you enabled precision boost overclocking. The real benchmark was the 4.1 gigahertz overclock at 1.4 volts. During load in all of these tests, all of the temperatures were acceptable for the CPU, which is great to see, and some of them were even lower than the stock configuration, even with the overvolt. After working with the cooler for a couple of weeks now, I can definitely feel confident in recommending the Scythe Mugen 5 cooler. This cooler comes in, generally speaking, at about $50 on Amazon and Newegg, and a lot of the times you can actually find it on sale, sometimes as low as $45 or somewhere in between $45 and $50. So for the amount of cooling performance you're getting for just under 50 bucks, this is definitely a bang for the buck option. If you're not looking into spending closer to 90 or 100 for one of the taller Noctuas, or even 100 or 150 for one of the water cooling options, this is definitely the way to go. In terms of the Ryzen CPUs, every time they come out, there's a standard version, the 3600 for example, and the 3600X. And the 3600X generally tends to be binned slightly better than the 3600, and it comes with a better cooler, and the price difference usually is about 50 bucks. In this case, I would definitely recommend, if you're looking for a CPU like that and you can fit this cooler in your case, I would definitely save the 50 bucks on buying the 3600 and pick up something like this Mugen 5. The Mugen 5 will definitely allow you to cool the CPU adequately and let the automatic overclocking kick in, or if you're like me and you want to manually overclock all of the cores or buy CCD, this will definitely help keep the temps down and let you clock all those cores up. If you like this review, definitely thumbs up the video and let me know in the comment section below what you're running and what machine you might want to use this cooler in the future. For links to all of the products in my Ryzen build and the Mugen 5 cooler from Scythe, definitely check out the description field below. If you're interested in reviews on tech products, PC building, server building, and tech gadgets, definitely get subscribed to the channel and click the bell notification below so you get email updates every time a video comes out. In the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter at Sam's Tech Stuff, Facebook, facebook.com/Sam's Tech Stuff, or on the website, samstechstuff.com.